You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
Hello everybody. A very warm welcome to this evening's debate. My name is Professor Sue Rogers, Interim Director of the UCL Institute of Education, also known as the IOE. I hope you're keeping safe and well in these extraordinary times. Like so many of our professional and personal activities, we've moved our public events online, but we want to keep them as interactive as possible, so please make good use of Twitter and the chat function on YouTube. Share your views and questions for this discussion. The hashtag to use on Twitter is hashtag IOE Debates. Also, just to remind everyone that the event is being recorded and will be available after the event. So I'm particularly pleased to be chairing this event, which poses a really important and challenging question. What if our education system changed for good in light of the Covid-19 global pandemic? When we planned this event some weeks ago, I don't think any of us could have envisaged the twists and turns in the education debate that have developed for all of us who are in any way involved in education at any level. Posing the question is a very real attempt for us to consider as a community what might emerge from the COVID crisis, the good and the bad, for reflection, discussion, creative thinking, and possible change. In the past weeks, we have seen our schools closed to all but the children of key workers and the most in need. This in itself is unprecedented and quite remarkable. We have seen the challenges and incredible efforts of our teaching profession and parents to provide remote and home education and make the best decisions they can in often less than ideal circumstances. Perhaps most of all, we have seen how COVID has both surfaced and exacerbated inequality, whether in relation to health outcomes, access to connectivity, and the technology on which we all now depend so much. There is still much to do to address some of the most challenging questions we face collectively. Today's debate is focused on schools, but schools are communities of practice that connect to early year settings, the health profession, and most importantly to parents, carers, and families. So it's not really possible to think about schools in isolation. And we shouldn't forget that behind the headlines are very human stories of pupils, parents and carers and teachers all feeling the struggles of separation from one another, from family routines, and overwhelmingly concerns to protect health and well-being. So to help us reflect on these issues, we've brought together a very experienced panel across the very different vantage points of national policy making and the front line. You'll have seen the full biographies on our website, but let me provide some very brief introductions. First up, we have Dr. Mary Bousted, Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union. Formerly a secondary school teacher herself, Mary now represents the interests of NEU's 450,000 members, the majority of them teachers, to the government and related stakeholders. Sir John Coles, Chief Executive of United Learning, which is the largest multi-academy trust in England, with over 80 academies and independent schools. Prior to this, from 1997 to 2012, John was a senior civil servant at the Department for Education, leading on the many areas of national education reform. Mrunal Sisodia, co-chair of the National Network of Parent-Carer Forums, comprising 151 local forums of parents and carers of children and young people with special educational needs and or disabilities, with 90,000 members in all across England. Prior to his work with NNPCF, Mrunal held senior roles in the charity and finance sectors. And our fourth panel member is Natalie Pereira, Executive Director and Head of Research at the Education Policy Institute. In 2016, Natalie left the Department for Education to set up the Education Policy Institute, which has quickly established itself as a leading source of analysis and commentary on education policy. It's really great to have these speakers with us. And as I said, I hope many more of you will add your views and questions to the discussion. Each panel member will present for 5 minutes, and colleagues online will keep you to time. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Mary Bousted. Over to you, Mary.
Thank you, Sue, and welcome to everyone. So the question I've been asked to answer in 5 minutes is, what if our education system changed for good in light of COVID-19? My first point is it's an ill wind that blows nobody any good. COVID-19 has been a spectacularly, catastrophically ill wind. But there may be some good that can come out of it out of all the harm that it's done, as children have been away from school and away from education, and as teachers' stress levels have risen as the pandemic has gone on. So what COVID-19 has exposed, in my view, the fault line between national government and schools and the need for a middle tier to coordinate lots of things. Now, I'm not going to say that the middle tier needs to be that schools go back to local authorities. I think probably that horse has bolted. But the need to have some form of local coordination between a local democratic tier, maybe that's a region, with a local authority having some investment and some relationship with schools, which may involve looking at things like admissions, exclusions, and a range of services available for schools. And crucially, when there are huge upheavals in the way that we run our education system, there is someone for government to talk to, because the fact of the matter is, government trying to talk to 19,000 schools, government not talking to parents, and government not talking to local authorities, who still are the majority employer of primary schools, has meant that government's messages have simply not got through. And I think the repeated changes to government guidance, I think it's 42 changes now in what the government has said they want schools to do, and the fact that so many parents are still reluctant to send their children back to school is indicative of a government's idea that you can have a direct line to schools and miss out parents and miss out local democracy. The fact that so many local authorities, particularly in areas still with a high R rate, have delayed opening schools or have not opened schools to the range of year groups that the government mandated, shows that the middle tier, the local democratic structure, will reassert itself, and government needs to talk to that and have a way of talking to that. So that's the first fault line. The second is qualifications. The fact of the matter is that when we had to stop school, because our country, because England relies on qualification by examination, and when the examinations couldn't happen, that has created huge problems, and those problems are not worked through properly. We just had to suddenly go to teacher predicted grades and rank ordering, which caused teachers huge problems. And we don't really have an idea from Ofqual. They keep being told that this will be fair and will be reliable and valid, but we don't really have the assurance that that will be the case, despite teachers doing their best, despite Ofqual absolutely doing its best. No one is doing this. There was no other alternative. That's what had to happen. But what that's shown is that if you put all your eggs in the exams basket and you can't take the exams, there's a real problem. So we do need to look at our qualification system. And next year, with the disruption that's happened with our qualifications and with the time taken out of school, it's clear that GCSEs and A-levels will not happen in the way that they happened in 2019. So Ofqual is talking about open book exams, it's talking about wider questions, but we're going to have to relook at systems of a teacher assessment contributing to qualifications. And for that, we're going to need to re-empower teachers about their ability to assess work both formatively and summatively. So that's important. The third one is accountability. The fact of the matter is that Ofsted has not been in schools now for months. It's had 5 new frameworks in 9 years. and still can't find a framework which will assess schools reliably and validly. And its effect on schools in disadvantaged areas is profound and very negative. My view is that Ofsted does have a role, and its role in this pandemic and in the months ahead should be on survey reports looking at what's happening in schools, what's happened with online learning, what might need to happen with blended learning, what's happening with trauma, what's happening with disadvantaged children. So let's get Ofsted, let's get in particular HMI doing the survey work which they abandoned, which actually was one of the best aspects of Ofsted. The fourth change for good, I think, is the focus on disadvantaged children and vulnerable children and the attainment gap. And it's very interesting that Conservative MPs have focused on this so fully. My question is that we know that 40, and the EPI showed us this in its report on grammar schools in 2016, 40% of the attainment gap is set in stone before children start school. And in every class of 30, an average class of 30, 9 of those children in that average class will be poor. So if there's a focus on disadvantage, let's keep that focus on disadvantage and let's start looking at structural changes in society, which mean that parents and carers have good jobs, have steady jobs, which are not on 0 hours contracts, and which stop children living in poverty. And that's the focus of the NEU's plan for education recovery. The focus of our plan is on disadvantaged children. It's on qualification reform. It's on more teachers, more support staff, and bigger footprint for schools so that we can get children back to education and we can start really looking after the most disadvantaged and the most vulnerable who will suffer from an education gap. And finally, if this pandemic enables us to think about schools and recognise schools which have shown that they are far more than academic hothouses, but they are public buildings at the centre of their community, essential for the life chances of vulnerable children and poor children, essential for community cohesion, places where children get fed, places where children get clothed, places where families get counselled, places where the most vulnerable children, and if there are safeguarding issues, the local authority is alerted, places where parents are alerted if their child needs speech and language therapy, places where children get psychological help and counselling, and places where we see the best of our society and where we want all to thrive. And there is recognition about that schools are community places for the common good, for the common weal, then that is a very good thing to come out of COVID-19.
Thank you very much, Mary. And I'm going to pass to John now as our second panel member.
Thanks very much, Sue. I think we could quite happily spend the whole hour talking about the themes Mary's introduced there. I was going to talk about some slightly different things, but I do think the exam system is one thing that where it's worth spending some time on at some point in this discussion. It seems to me that I agree with you that we managed to do as fair a job of assessing children this year as we normally would do. My conclusion from that is the exam system is hugely important. Having exams, so we may debate that as we go on. First thing I would say really is that to say what this are going to be, and we should just remember we're only a very small proportion of the way through the opportunities that we'll have to learn from COVID-19. I think we're about to go into a period where for some months to come, there'll have to be significant adaptation, and out of hardship, we'll have to be looking at, and we may develop and find practices which become powerful and the norm over that time, and we for those opportunities as we go. Some themes, though, that I did want to draw out, first of all, and some of these chime with some of what Mary said. The first is, it seems to me that in this period, there is an increase in, so far, I think, in the esteem and value which the public place and teachers, I think the lived experience of parents trying to homeschool has reminded them of how difficult the professional job of being a teacher is. I think the challenge of having to close schools and remain open has emphasised what a key job teachers do. And I think at the moment, as people start getting anxious about whether or not their children can go back to school, the centrality of school in people's lives in all of the ways that Mary said, in terms of their well-being as well as in terms of their education, I think has been brought home really strongly for teachers. I think there is the potential here for improvement and raising of the status of schools and teaching, and that is something that we just need to maintain through the period of reopening and show ourselves to be a vital and professional public service throughout that time. Second key theme is I think that some really important issues have been raised through this time, which are quite deep and are both educational and social. So the discussion we've just had about seasonal meals is obviously one of those. The digital divide is another of those. The welfare and safety of children at home is a third. And it seems to me that the Black Lives Matter and its strengthening and huge prominence in this period is in part a consequence of the period of reflection and that we have just gone through. And all of these things are huge, I think will be of huge long-term importance. All of them have for the education service. Some more specific then opportunities that come out of it. We'll go into a period of economic recovery, and that will bring some opportunities for us. Government will need to do things to keep the construction industry going. The labour market will be under pressure. There is a retention opportunity for schools. There is an opportunity for real investment in school buildings, and we should be pressing the case for that. I think we'll find the period of catch-up leads us to a need to develop practices of assessment and diagnostic assessment and building our skill professionals, all of those areas, which could be tremendously important for the future. I think we've got an opportunity for technology at this moment, and educational technology, to have a much more rational and thoughtful debate about the place of technology in education. Too often, discussion about technology has been polarised between those who think it's the answer to everything and those who think it's the answer to nothing. Neither of these things is right. And the fact that all of us have had to spend a lot of time using technology in our daily working lives, I think means that we will have the opportunity to have a better discussion about that and to find the ways in which technology really does benefit us. And to do that in a thoughtful way. I think there may be some substantial long-term changes. Just a couple more things very quickly. There may be some substantial long-term changes to practices. So one area I think may be widespread use of curriculum materials that is not the resourcing. A second is changes to working patterns and practices. I think there are opportunities for education to learn about flexible working in a way lots of the economy have had to do long before now. And finally, it seems to me that the Tim Brighouse, Bob Moon idea of the open school, something that may be a long-term institutional opportunity for the education system to build something very powerful and long-lasting. Huge number of other things we could talk about, but that's 5.5 minutes, I think.
Yeah. Thank you very much, John, and some more thought-provoking points there, and some overlap, but also some additional points. So thank you for that. I've made a note of those. At this point, then, I'm going to pass on to Mrunal, please, for your 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. And the first thing I want to say is thank you for inviting me to come and speak and put a parental view and put a special educational needs view on this debate. I think that's an optic that is so often missed, and I'm very pleased to have this opportunity. It's very hard at the minute to talk about opportunities, to step out of what we're experiencing as parents and as families. And I think I actually want to start with some of the real challenges and negatives that are coming out of COVID-19 for our families, because I think these are the things that we need to address and build upon. So let's be honest, the school system, when it came to SEND, was already creaking before COVID-19 came along. And COVID-19 has exacerbated some of those cracks, and some of them now feel very much like chasms. What are parents reporting at the moment? What are families saying about their lived experience when it comes to school of education in this period? Firstly, we know a lot of both John and Mary are absolutely right. Teaching is hard. Teaching is hard, and it's even harder if you've got a young person with special needs, additional needs, because absent the specialist teaching that schools are able to provide, absent the specialist equipment and resources that schools are able to provide, many parents are reporting that they are not getting any sort of differentiated curriculum when it comes to their children's SEND, and they really are being left further and further behind. School also provides very important respite care for families with special educational needs. That it's a fixed time when their young person is out of the house. There's a double whammy here, because not only are many young people with SEND not in school, the respite services that they would call upon outside of school are no longer operating. So we're talking about a real pressure cooker environment, and many families are feeling abandoned. And when it comes to the medical interventions, many of those, again, sourced through school, aren't happening effectively at the moment, because medical services have been pulled back and are focusing very heavily upon the COVID-19 response. That's the environment in which that's what families are describing to us, and it really isn't pretty. And I think that there will be a long tail to this when it comes to adverse effects on outcomes for children, young people, and families. Flipping it around, I think that we are seeing some things being done well, and these are the same things, the same sort of values and principles that lead to a good quality educational provision for SEND. Where they are being applied, they're shining through. So we always talk about three things. The first thing being provision needs to be person-centered and not provision-driven. What we mean by that, don't tell us what you've got, give us what we need. And there's been some real examples of where reasonable adjustments have been made to accommodate children in this period, and children have thrived. Children with SEND have thrived. Very rarely happens, but that person-centered approach really works. The second thing that we always look for is a joint working across the system. Our kids are vulnerable. SEND kids are vulnerable for many, many reasons. And we always look towards a joined up approach between school, social care services, and health services. And some of the COVID-19 crisis has forced those conversations to happen with greater urgency than they were happening before. Probably fewer of them are happening because services are prioritizing, and fewer children are getting the services they need. But where they are happening, we are seeing glimmers of a more joined up approach. The last thing that we always look for is really the silver bullet, really the thing that changed everything, and that is co-production with families. Please, parents are on your side. We want our children to succeed just as much as you do, and please treat us as allies and work with us, and let us tell you about what's different, what's unique about our child, and let's try and build on that by working together through the school system. And I just wanted to end on a bigger point, which I think that both Mary and John have touched on, which is through this crisis, as a society, we have made some choices. We have prioritized the welfare of those that are clinically vulnerable. Children are less clinically vulnerable to this disease. However, whilst they aren't directly impacted by the disease, they have certainly been impacted by the choices that we as a society have made in our response to the disease. And I think that children have been disadvantaged by our response to the disease as a society. And I think that disadvantaged children have been doubly disadvantaged, including those with SEND. And I hope, and I think that all of us have a role in this, is to make sure that when we come out of this, and as we come out of this, we as a society seek to rebalance that, recognize that and rebalance that.
Thank you very much, Mrunal. Thank you very much. We'll come back to many of those points, I'm sure, in questions. But let's move to our final panel member. Natalie, over to you.
Thank you, Sue. So the COVID-19 pandemic has, I think, cast a really harsh light on the prevalence of inequality in this country. And despite being the sixth largest economy in the world, the past few months have unearthed countless and heartbreaking stories of poverty, of domestic abuse, and of loss. And we in the education world, we've always known that the home learning environment has a deep, lasting impact on children's outcomes. But policymakers, I think it's fair to say, haven't been paying enough attention to the fragility of the home. And the closure of schools has exposed the immense void of other services that should be supporting families. So early intervention and youth services, for example, have been amongst those that have been cut by around a fifth in real terms over the past decade. And we may not have always noticed the extent of those cuts because schools have been there working tirelessly to plug the gap. But when the school gates close, we can see now the dire circumstances in which many families are living. Adequate housing space, financial security, nutrition, a home free from abuse and neglect. These are all some of the basic pillars that children need in order to thrive. But as we've seen, many are living in homes without these fundamental needs being met. But these needs and these issues, they won't be tackled overnight. So the question is, equipped with this new understanding of how family circumstances can affect learning and well-being, what changes can or should we make to the education system? Now, some people will say that we shouldn't lower our expectations of poor kids or those who are vulnerable. They say that we are at risk of placing too much weight on the impact of trauma or poverty. They'll say that many disadvantaged children have gone on to become successful. But the reality is that those kids that we've seen, like Marcus Rashford in the media this week, are the exception and not the norm. And they succeed in spite of the system and not because of it. So how can we change? One of the things I've been reflecting on during this period of uncertainty and disruption is that we've seen so many examples of people being more compassionate. And so with the added insight into the lives of many families, I've been wondering whether and how our education system is more compassionate. So can we recognise schools cannot support children in isolation, that we need an early intervention, youth and family and social care system that can work with schools to support children and families more holistically? Can we stop disproportionately excluding, either formally or through managed moves, poor kids, Black kids, kids in the social care system and kids with social, emotional and mental health needs? Can we better understand the challenges facing disadvantaged schools or schools that serve disadvantaged communities and create an accountability system that supports and nurtures those schools? Can we better reward teachers who work in those schools so they want to stay and give pupils some stability? Can we recognise how difficult it is to provide specialist support for children with SEND and then fund that support properly? Can we focus on policies that will narrow the attainment gap between disadvantaged children and their peers, not just during a pandemic, but all the time? We know that the gap will inevitably widen as a result of the pandemic, but let's not forget that it was already at around 1.5 years and growing even before COVID-19. Maybe this is the wake-up call that we needed to focus on the things that matter most. And I think that if we can come away from the pandemic with more compassion and with policies that emit more compassion, then this won't have been a wasted moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and thank you to all of our panel members for presenting their thoughts. And there's lots of overlap here, and I guess the thing that's really coming forward strongly is the concept of disadvantage. And all of us have been aware of the debates around how we address catching up, whether it's summer schools, catch-up schemes. But of course, the other side of that is around labelling children as vulnerable. There are lots of challenges around that too. So I just want to put to the panel, any kind of thoughts about the immediate debates around how we address those children who might be falling behind, for example, in because of lockdown. Could I just get some thoughts from each of you on that? And Mary, could I start with you? What's the answer?
Yeah, I think the focus on catch-up is problematic, because I think that obviously, I'm just very struck by Natalie's contribution, which I thought was outstanding. And the fact that it's like the problem of the poor is they're always with us. The problem of disadvantage is that the gap was growing again before COVID and will be worse after. And that disadvantage gap is rooted in poverty, and it's rooted not only in poverty, but inequality. So, and Natalie's, thought that, and Laura McInerney talks about this as well, and I talk about it a lot. The idea has been in the last 10 years that schools can address these issues on their own, that you can decimate local authority funding by 40%. You can expect children to wait for their CAM services for 6 months, and they have to be suicidal before they get, in some areas, before they get to see a mental health specialist. That children can be poor. Any new surveys show after Christmas, when we do this survey about food poverty, that teachers say that children come back after the Christmas holidays and after the summer holidays thinner and tired, and teachers are buying shoes, they're buying clothes, schools are running food clubs. So if we're going to deal with the education disadvantage gap, we have to deal with the fact that 9 in every 30 of the average class of pupils will be poor. And as a society, if we really care about that, then we have to do something to support schools to deal with the attainment gap as well. That is a nakedly political point, and I have no shame in saying that is a nakedly political point. And the final, if you want a really nakedly political point, I find it a bit rich for Conservative politicians to suddenly, who have voted for a 5-week delay in universal credit, have voted for a 2-child limit on benefits, who voted to actually, in real terms, make poor children poorer and make their family's life less secure, to suddenly become very, very concerned about disadvantage. Because where was their concern before COVID-19?
Thanks, Mary. I'm going to now ask John. Would you like to comment on this difficulty we have, this challenge? Thank you.
So the question is about children of missed learning. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So look, I'm inclined to think that there's just a bit too much sort of magical thinking going on in the political world, that if somehow you've got the right sort of strategy for catch up, suddenly children won't have missed the amount of education that they have. That's not right, is it? The things we can do, and just very good quality pedagogical practice, is the thing that schools are particularly strong at, isn't it? So you're really trying to understand precisely what is it that children don't know and understand, and then teaching them the things they don't know and understand is the thing that schools do well. Government needs to do is to support schools to do that more and more intensively, and to resource that. So that seems to be job number one. The much broader point, which I think Mrunal was starting to talk about, is, I think the country owes this generation of young people in a big way. These people in schools and in universities now were not themselves at risk from this virus. We had all been as susceptible to the virus as young people are. There is absolutely no lockdown at all. And so what young people have been doing in giving up this amount of their education and this amount of their wider lives is a huge public service in something society. It's restricting themselves and their own opportunities in order to protect the elderly and the vulnerable, who are the people at risk from the virus. So I think so there's a huge issue to my mind of intergenerational fairness here. And there's an enormous need for the country now to invest heavily in these young people who, may have missed a chunk of their early education, who may have had their exams disrupted, who may have their exams disrupted in the coming years, who may be leaving school and university to a labor which is the worst that can ever in our lifetimes. We must invest now heavily in this generation of young people and treat it as a major priority for recovery. And for schools to do their job well, but bigger societal job for this generation of young people as well.
Thank you, John. And we're getting some questions in now from Twitter. So before I come to other panel members, if I could just put one in front of you, which is related really around the discussion of hiring private tutors to allow these students to catch up. What is the panel's view on that? I mean, obviously there are quality issues around this that we should all be concerned about. And we have obviously teachers who badly need a break. What is your view? Could I ask Natalie perhaps to come in on that issue? Thank you.
Yeah, we know that there's evidence around the impact of one-to-one and small group tuition. What we've recommended the government do in terms of supporting pupils when they go back to school is that they target funding to the most disadvantaged pupils, those who are eligible for the pupil premium, and then let schools decide, using the best available evidence and the understanding of their own pupils and their own communities, how best to use that money to help pupils to catch up, or indeed to help with their pastoral or well-being needs. So I think tuition has its place, but it's not everything that we need to put in place if we want to get young people back.
Thanks, Natalie. Mrunal, could I get your perspective on the idea of tutors, please?
Could I perhaps sort of start in a slightly different place, which is I almost think catch-up is the wrong question. What I mean by that is very, very few parents are talking to me about catch-up. What they're talking about is a calm, purposeful, successful reintegration into school, a management of their children's anxieties, and trying to make sure that the very obvious stresses and strains that this has placed on their children doesn't have a long tail and doesn't have a long-term impact. So I think I almost think catch-up is a bit of a red herring at the minute. I think our focus as a community, as a society, should be getting children back into school and making sure that they are happy and safe there. And that's going to be a big task in itself, with so few, with the very low levels of parental confidence at the moment around sending their children back into school. So I'd almost challenge the idea that catch-up is a priority and should be a priority. I also think I'd like to build on what Mary and Natalie were saying around early help, because I think this is going to be absolutely critical when we talk about catch-up in the wider sense of catch-up of a child's more holistic well-being, not academically, but holistic well-being, I think the early help offer from local areas is absolutely critical, because the stories that we hear are about parents who go along to a school to express a concern that a local area, because of cuts, because of a lack of services, isn't able to respond to promptly, that then turns into a problem, that then turns into a crisis. And when it turns into a crisis, that's when we respond. We've got to reverse that. And we've got to think about the well-being of our children, not just academically, but I'd argue much more holistically, and make sure that early help and early intervention is available to them at the right point.
Thank you very much, Mrunal. I think we could take one more comment on that if anybody on the panel just very briefly wanted to come back on anything that's been said around this topic before we move on to a different area, just looking at the questions coming in. Anybody want to have a final word on this challenge we have about... Yes, sure. John.
So, I mean, I take all the points about well-being and the need to bring children back safely and happily to school. Our experience of reopening schools to more children in the last few weeks has been children are delighted to be back at school, and so are staff. And yes, there are well-being issues to address, but fundamentally, most children are happy to be back at school, enjoy the routine, enjoy seeing their friends, the social aspects, and enjoy getting back to learning. And I do think there's a deep and profound problem of catch-up that really is a central challenge for the education system. I have a daughter and so you can imagine what I'm thinking about her current situation, the amount of school that she has missed. And that is what parents around the country are thinking, and it is really very important. And I want to go back to Natalie's sort of founding point, that individual one-to-one and small missions we have really strong evidence is effective. It's one of the few things that's genuinely gap narrowing. If you give the same intervention to the most deprived children and to the most affluent children, actually the most deprived make the most progress, and those who are in care make dramatic progress. Looked after children make dramatic progress in one-to-one tuition. So this is a great intervention, powerful powering one, and the thing that we've got to do is just link it up well with everything else that schools are doing so that it's properly connected to the curriculum and to the teaching in the classroom and to the wider pastoral and other support that's happening in schools. And that for me is the crucial task.
Thanks very much, John. So I think we need to change tack now. And I just want to pick up on a question that came in quite early. One of the interesting things that we've been noticing recently is the interest in teaching, in becoming a teacher in COVID times. And we're certainly getting lots of interest in our programs, which is wonderful. And that kind of capacity building is so important for the profession. And but the big challenge is that around this, of course, there's huge risk for schools in having students in to learn the trade of teaching and the craft of teaching. So I just think, thinking about the wider teaching community, what are your thoughts, panel members, on, what can we do to ensure that we can work collectively to keep those great potential teachers coming into the system during this really difficult time? Let's see, who would like to start? Mary, can I ask you for your views on that?
Well, I'm going to wait for Natalie to come in with the report that they just did yesterday about the position. Would you say something else? I mean, obviously that's positive in terms of particularly the secondary school bulge and particularly shortage subjects. That's really positive. My point really would be, however, that we can get teachers in through the front door, but if we don't stop them exiting very quickly through the back door, then that's going to be a very short-lived boon. And so the fact of the matter is 22% of teachers leave within 2 years of qualifying, 40% leave within 10 years. And we have hundreds of thousands of teachers who trained at expense to the nation and latterly at expense to themselves, and who go into teaching and find the job of being a teacher so difficult and so stressful that they leave. And when they leave, overwhelmingly, they say they leave because of the stresses of the job, because teachers work the most unpaid overtime of any profession, and because so much of the work that they are required to do, they do not feel is useful. They don't feel it's rooted in best practice. They don't feel it helps their professional practice. And crucially, and Andrea Schleicher, who's the chief guru for at the OECD for education, leads the head of education at the OECD, leads the OECD education division, says if you treat teachers like widgets on a factory production line, they will exit the production line very quickly. So he talks about trust in teachers. He talks about real investment in continued professional development. He talks about teaching as a good job. He talks about collaboration. And he talks about teachers having a strong sense of professional agency. And if we are to stop the drain, stop the hemorrhage of teachers from our profession, then that's what we have to do. That's even more important. I'm a union leader, but that's even more important than pay. Pay is very important, but the quality of the work that we ask teachers to do, the sense that we have to treat them like adults, the sense that we have to treat them well, the fact that teachers leave in droves is the biggest strain on standards in our education system. And that is particularly the case for children in disadvantaged schools and schools serving disadvantaged areas, where Natalie's report about Ofsted shows that schools in disadvantaged areas who are making real progress in value added are much more likely to be given requires improvement or in special measures, where schools in the leafy suburbs, which show similar percentile drops in value added, are more likely to get good or outstanding. We have an inspection service which inspects schools on the quality of their pupil intake, not on the quality of the education they provide. And unless we redress the inequality in our accountability, the poorest and most disadvantaged schools will always find it the most difficult to recruit teachers and leaders. They will find it the most difficult to recruit, in particular, teachers in shortage subjects. And how have we ended up with an education system where the most disadvantaged schools and the poorest children have the worst access to subject specialist teachers and to leaders and teachers who will stay in those schools? It's a disgrace.
Thank you, Mary. I'm going to bring Natalie in at this point. Natalie.
Yeah, so as Mary said, we published a report today which estimated that as a result of the impending COVID-related recession, we're likely to see an increase in teacher numbers by around 20 to 40%, which, as Mary says, will definitely help with the recruitment crisis we've seen in recent years. But Mary's also right to point out that there's a real risk that we won't keep new teachers in the system. And although teaching does become a more attractive profession for graduates during a recession because of pay, but also because of job stability, we know that they're more likely to leave earlier on. If we look at international evidence, and I know that Mary says pay isn't the be-all and end-all, but if we look at some of the international evidence, we know that extra payments in the first 5 years of a teacher's career and extra payments for those who are teaching in challenging areas can help counter some of those retention challenges. So we've been calling on the government to implement those kinds of retention schemes.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Can I ask if Mrunal or John would like to come in on this particular topic? Perhaps could I ask Mrunal, I mean, how do parents, how are they situated in this area? And given that we think of them as the first educators, and co-education has become something that we're now working with daily.
It's a really interesting idea, isn't it? Because I think that again, this is where I think we're seeing the disadvantage gulf again, isn't it? Because I think the disadvantaged households are much less they're much less likely to successfully homeschool. We've seen all the statistics on that, and we understand why. It's everything from the digital divide to literally not having a physical space in which you can do work uninterrupted. And I think we all understand that. But I think that partnership between parents and teachers, which I was talking to earlier, is even more important in this environment, in the sense that where do children learn the most? Well, actually, it probably is at home. Their parents have probably the biggest influence on them, and tapping into that resource is something that I think is something that the teaching profession, when we see really good examples of that, particularly in the SEND world, is what works really well and really resonates. So I think that certainly many parents will have renewed respect and regard for the teaching profession through this period, but we'll also be looking to build on some of the practices that have developed between home and school learning, and see if there's things that we can take out of that.
Thanks very much, Mrinal. And John, could I just bring you in to think? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Obviously, a few thousand teachers in and fundamentally, I agree with a lot of the points that Mary made. I do think that it's, staff being treated well, it's the quality of the work, it's meaningful work, it's good opportunities to develop professionally, as well as being paid properly, which are sort of fundamental parts of keeping teachers and supporting them. So I do think that's at the heart of it. I think that, I mentioned earlier in what I said at the start, that flexible working is an area where I do think maybe some of what we're developing at the moment could be valuable and useful into the future. If you look at the education system, the school system as a whole, we're vastly behind the rest of the economy on flexible working. I think we can all run through the reasons why that might be the case and why there are particular difficulties going on. It seems to me that in an economy where we increasingly expect to be able to work flexibly and remotely sometimes, we're going to have to support that in the education world as well. We're going to have to with the rest of the economy. We're through this period of lockdown, but lots of teachers are accessing professional development, and we're making that available online. That feels like a real, we'll come out of this because there are those opportunities that we can create remotely. And the other thing that we've done in a big way, which I think has made a difference to teachers in just the huge volume of curriculum resources we've produced. So, teachers have been downloading from our sites, tens of thousands of resources which they're using in their teaching. So I do think we've got to think kind of very responsibly and reflectively as employers about how do we make people's working days as good as they can be? How do we make it easy for them to do a good job? How do we assume that they're trying to do a good job and look at as many opportunities now as we can to and develop teachers? I think that comes along with accountability. I think we all need accountability. I think we're all at our best when we feel accountable, but that's accountability for what we're doing, not a sort of tick box exercise. And finally, I do think this is a major opportunity for the school system. We are bringing in hundreds of new teachers at the moment, and we've seen continued very strong interest in our initial teacher training programs. I hope that's replicated across the country and across schools. It seems that it is. And take advantage of that and then treat well and invest in the talented people coming into the profession.
Thanks, John. And I'm reminded that we only have 5 minutes left and we could debate these topics for very much longer. So I'm just going to ask each panel member to respond to a question very briefly, in a sentence if possible, we've heard about so many different issues, but what is for you the single most important lesson to take from the past 3 months or so of lockdown in terms of our school system? So just single most important lesson. And this is trying to pull together many of the questions that you will see on Twitter. So if you could each share in turn. And I'm just wondering, Muriel, could I ask you to be the first? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think the single biggest thing that I hope we can take out of this is the recognition that schools are not just about education. Schools are about the centre of the community, and schools are where we should be looking to bring back a much more holistic support structure around children. And that really is about joint working, multi-agency working for those vulnerable and disadvantaged kids, especially those with SEND, when it comes to things such as social care, health services, working in an allied way with education, and let's not forget parents.
Thank you, Muriel. Brilliant. Natalie, can I ask you for your single lesson?
Yeah, I think it's that insight as to just how some families are living on the edge and on a knife edge, really, and how the removal of schools and free school meals can plunge, and and unstable employment can plunge them into poverty, and the kind of domino effect that has on children's lives.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you for being so brief. John? John, may I ask for your single lesson from the last 3 months?
I think one that isn't news to me, but I think it's been news to quite a large part of the country, is just what heroic people teachers and head teachers are, and what a great job they do day in, day out for children and young people. And I think there are lots of things that have happened which have really brought that to the forefront of people's attention.
Thank you, John. Brilliant. And thanks for being so brief. And finally, Mary, if I could ask you to be brief.
Yes, very brief. I just want to re-say the thing that 40% of the attainment gap is cemented before children start school, and that you cannot expect schools to tackle on their own the huge crushing weight of poverty and inequality. Schools have a job to do, but we need schools to be enmeshed in local authorities which have good and well-funded services for children, so that they are not constantly in danger. The 9 in every 30 children who will be poor, constantly in danger of falling through a very, very holey net.
Thank you, Mary. And I have to say, you've left us with some really powerful messages. And my hope with everybody on this call, I suspect, is that we can really turn this into some positive action and really make a difference. And I think we all feel passionately about that. And just final word then, in the last minute, we did an Instagram poll. Do you think school will change very much as a result of the lockdown experience? And the voting is in. 82% say yes, by a lot. Only 18% not at all, not much at all. So I'm taking that as a kind of signal that we're all signed up for this exciting agenda. Let's turn this into something really meaningful for those children and our very, very special teachers and everybody who works in the community, and our parents, of course, too. So thank you very much to our panel members and to the audience. It's been a brilliant evening. I've really enjoyed listening to your views. We have lots of questions we haven't answered, but they're there for you to look at later. So thanks very much. And I think that is time to say goodnight. Thank you.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.